They called her a welfare queen. Not a woman, not a mother, not a human being, just a symbol, crafted in smoke-filled political rooms, fed to media like poison candy, and swallowed by America as truth. She was painted as lazy, deceitful, greedy, a black woman in a Cadillac, wearing fur coats, scamming hard-working taxpayers out of their money. But here's the dark truth. She never existed. Not in the way they told it. Not in the way America believed. The welfare queen was a myth, a weapon, a lie so powerful that it reshaped U.S. policy, dismantled social safety nets, and condemned millions of poor families, black, white, Latino, Asian, to decades of suffering. And today, nearly 50 years later, millions are still paying the price for that lie. This is the story no one wants to tell. The 1970s. America was restless. The civil rights movement had shaken the nation. Jim Crow was legally dead, but racial tensions were alive and burning. White America looked around and saw something they resented. Black families moving into suburbs, affirmative action opening job doors, and government programs offering food stamps and health care to those long denied. Enter politics. In 1976, Ronald Reagan was running for president. He needed a villain, a face to attach to big government waste. And he found it in the stereotype of a woman he called the welfare queen. At rallies, Reagan told the story of a Chicago woman who allegedly used 80 fake names, 30 addresses, 12 Social Security cards, and collected hundreds of thousands in benefits. He never said her name, but he didn't need to. The imagery was coded. The welfare queen was always described as black, urban, and immoral. The crowd roared. The myth took off. The media amplified it, running stories of welfare abuse, splashing photos of black mothers in line for benefits, rarely showing the millions of white recipients. Overnight, the welfare queen became the boogeyman of American politics. But here's the truth they buried. The real woman Reagan referenced, Linda Taylor, was a con artist, but her story had little to do with welfare. She had committed fraud, yes, but also kidnapping, theft, and even suspected murder. Instead of being remembered for her crimes, she was reduced to a caricature of welfare abuse, a caricature designed to destroy public trust in social programs. Reagan's welfare queen myth wasn't just a story, it was a strategy. By the late 1970s, more than 20 million Americans relied on welfare programs. Contrary to the myth, most were white, but showing white mothers on welfare didn't fit the agenda. Black women were chosen as a face because it tapped into deep-rooted racist stereotypes. Lazy, hyperfertile, irresponsible, parasitic. The lie worked. Polls showed that by the 1980s, most Americans believed welfare fraud was widespread, even though government reports found fraud rates under 5%. But truth didn't matter. Perception did. Politicians painted welfare as a trap, a lifestyle choice for poor black women who refused to work. The language shifted. Welfare wasn't help, it was dependency. And anyone defending it was accused of enabling laziness. The result? Welfare became politically toxic. Cutting welfare became patriotic. And the war on poor families had begun. By the 1990s, the welfare queen myth had already caused irreversible damage. In 1996, President Bill Clinton signed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. It sounded noble, personal responsibility, but behind the name was devastation. The law gutted welfare, imposing strict work requirements, time limits, and blocked grants that gave states power to restrict aid. Overnight, millions lost support. Welfare rolls plummeted, not because poverty disappeared, but because access was strangled. Here's the human cost. In Mississippi, families had to prove they were working to qualify for benefits, even in towns where jobs didn't exist. In many states, only 1 out of every 10 poor families received cash aid. Children went hungry. Mothers skipped meals. Entire neighborhoods sank deeper into poverty. But the worst part? The myth didn't just destroy welfare. It poisoned how America viewed poverty itself. Poor people were no longer seen as struggling. They were seen as cheating. Why was the welfare queen always imagined as black? Because it wasn't just about economics. It was about race and gender. For centuries, black women were stereotyped in two extremes: the mammy, who worked endlessly for white families, and the Jezebel accused of promiscuity and irresponsibility. The welfare queen combined both. She was painted as sexually irresponsible, having too many children, and financially irresponsible, living off the state. This caricature gave white America a convenient scapegoat. The struggling economy? Blame the welfare queen. Rising taxes? Blame the welfare queen. Neighborhood decline? Blame the welfare queen. And so, millions of working-class whites, themselves rely on government aid, turn against the very programs keeping them afloat. They believed the lie that welfare was a black scam and voted for politicians who cut their own lifelines. Divide and conquer. That was the strategy. And it worked perfectly. Fast forward to today. The myth is alive. In 2023, nearly 40% of children in the U.S. lived in low-income families. Black and Latino children are disproportionately represented. But the majority of poor children are white. Welfare programs today reach far fewer families than in the 1970s, even though poverty has not disappeared. Why? Because the shadow of the welfare queen still dictates policy. Politicians still warn against dependency. Media outlets still run stories about benefit fraud, while ignoring corporate tax evasion that costs billions more. And the cycle continues. Families fall into poverty, social safety nets fail them, and America blames the poor instead of the system. The myth destroyed not just black women's reputations. It destroyed millions of lives. Here's the secret no one wants to admit. The welfare queen myth was never about welfare abuse. It was about political control. Welfare reform wasn't designed to save money. It was designed to shift blame. Instead of holding corporations accountable for outsourcing jobs, instead of addressing wage stagnation, instead of tackling structural racism, politicians gave America a scapegoat, a poor black woman stealing your taxes. The irony? Corporate fraud, tax evasion, and defense overspending cost America hundreds of billions annually. But the media didn't make catchy villains out of CEOs or generals. They made one out of the single black mother on food stamps. Because it was easier, because it was useful, because racism sells. So how do we undo the damage? How do we finally kill the myth that refuses to die? Tell the truth. Expose the numbers. Most welfare recipients are white. Fraud rates are tiny. The real scammers are corporations and billionaires. Rebuild the safety net. Universal child care, guaranteed income, health care access. These are not luxuries. They are necessities. They strengthen society, not weaken it. Stop criminalizing poverty. Poor families are not failures. Poverty is not a crime. It is a policy choice. Listen to the voices silenced. Black women who bore the brunt of this myth are also the leaders with solutions, activists, scholars, and mothers who know what real justice requires. The myth can only die if we replace it with truth, and if that truth is louder than the lie. The welfare queen never existed as they told it, but her ghost still haunts America. She lives in every budget cut, every denied application, every hungry child, every shamed mother. She is a shadow cast over every poor family who dares to ask for help. One lie, that's all it took. A single stereotype, a single campaign trail story, a single racist myth that spread like wildfire, and millions are still paying the price. The next time you hear someone talk about welfare fraud, remember this. The biggest fraud wasn't a black mother with food stamps. The biggest fraud was the myth itself. And America is still living with the bill. They told us a story about a woman in a Cadillac, draped in fur, scamming the system. But the truth is, the real scam was the story itself. It wasn't just a lie about one woman. It was a political strategy that changed how America treats the poor, how America sees black women, and how America funds, or refuses to fund basic human dignity. And here's the painful part. We are still living inside that lie. When we look at debates about social programs today, Medicaid, food stamps, housing vouchers, child care subsidies, the same coded language comes back. Words like dependency, handouts, and takers still dominate political speeches. Think about how the media frames poverty. When a black mother asks for help, she's portrayed as irresponsible. When a white corporation takes billions in subsidies, it's called economic development. When Wall Street gets bailed out, It's too big to fail. But when working-class families get $300 in food stamps, it's treated as a national crisis. That hypocrisy is not accidental. It's a direct child of the welfare queen myth. It continues to shape voter opinions, fuel budget cuts, and justify inequality. Statistics can tell us fraud rates are less than 5%. They can show us that most welfare recipients are white. They can map child poverty percentages across states. But numbers can't fully show what the myth feels like for the people living under its shadow. Imagine being a single mother who lost her job because her factory closed. Imagine standing in line for food assistance, only feel the glares of strangers who have already judged you guilty of being a welfare queen. Imagine being a child growing up hungry, not because your parent doesn't care, but because the system designed to catch you was dismantled decades ago. And then, when you speak up, society tells you that your family's poverty is a result of laziness, not policy. That shame, that stigma, it's a psychological weapon, and it is just as destructive as poverty itself. Let's bring this into the present. Housing. In many U.S. cities, the waiting list for affordable housing is so long that families wait years. Yet every proposal for housing expansion gets dismissed with, "We can't afford more welfare." Healthcare, Medicaid expansion saves lives, but several states still reject it, using the same old fear. We don't want dependency. Childcare. Politicians say America values families, but refuse universal childcare, warning that it would create a welfare state. Do you see the pattern? The ghost of the welfare queen still whispers in the ears of lawmakers every time they slash a budget. The welfare queen story was more than a smear. It was one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in U.S. history. Why? Because it convinced poor and working-class people to turn against themselves. It made neighbors suspicious of neighbors. It made struggling families feel ashamed to ask for help. It gave the wealthy political cover to dismantle programs that actually reduce poverty. In other words, the myth stole not just money, it stole solidarity. And when solidarity dies, injustice thrives. What we must do. I don't believe the myth has to define the future, but it will if we don't speak louder than the lie. Here's what we must contribute as a society. Retell the story. Truthfully, we must expose the falsehood again and again. Every time someone says welfare abuse, we respond with facts, with history, with humanity. Fight the stigma. Poverty is not a moral failing. Struggling to survive is not shameful. Asking for help is not weakness. We need to change how we talk about poverty in everyday conversations, classrooms, and media. Hold power accountable. Corporate tax fraud and government waste cost hundreds of billions more than welfare ever did. Yet the poorest Americans get shamed for needing $200 in assistance. We need to shift our anger upward, not downward. Rebuild the safety net. America is wealthy enough to provide universal health care, affordable housing, childcare, and guaranteed income. The issue isn't resources. The issue is willpower poisoned by stereotypes. Center the voices of black women. Because the myth targeted them most, their voices must lead the truth-telling. Activists, community leaders, and scholars have been carrying this fight for decades. We need to amplify them, not erase them. Let's be crystal clear. Every child who goes to bed hungry in America is a direct consequence of the welfare queen myth. Every parent forced to work 2 jobs and still can't afford health care is paying for that lie. Every community devastated by underfunded schools and shuttered hospitals is living under its shadow. And the hardest truth? Many Americans still believe it. The myth still shapes elections, still determines budgets, still fuels resentment between working-class black, white, and brown families who actually need each other. Imagine a society where we flip the script, where a struggling family is not shamed, but supported, where receiving help is seen as a stepping stone, not a scarlet letter. Imagine policies designed not around punishment and suspicion, but around dignity and empowerment. A mother gets child care support so she can finish her degree. A father gets housing vouchers so his kids don't sleep in cars. A child gets access to nutritious meals without stigma. And none of them are branded as abusers. That is not a fantasy. It's a choice. And America has the resources to make that choice. The only obstacle is the myth. We've walked through nearly 50 years of deception, politics, and pain. We've seen how a single racist stereotype, the welfare queen, was weaponized to destroy millions of lives and continues to shape how we see poverty today. But here's the part that matters most. We are not powerless. We can kill this myth once and for all, by refusing to believe it, by challenging it, by speaking truth louder than the lies. And that starts with you. Thank you for staying with us through this difficult but necessary story. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe America can ever rebuild the safety net that was destroyed by this myth? And what would you change first? Healthcare, housing, childcare, or income support? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation that the politicians don't want us to have. If this story opened your eyes, if it gave you something to think about, please subscribe to our channel. We dive deep into the truths history tried to bury, the lies society still tells, and the stories that still shape our lives. Hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and together, let's rewrite the narrative. Because the myth destroyed millions, but the truth, our truth, can rebuild millions more.